The night my mom called the police on me was the same night her own words finally stood against her. She didn't just yell at me or slam a door. My mom actually called the police on me, standing in our driveway with her arms crossed like I was some stranger trespassing. The funny part, if you can call it that, is that the whole thing started because of a text she sent at 2 in the morning. A text she pretended didn't exist, even though it was still glowing on my screen. "Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm 32, and I never imagined my mom would look at me like a problem to be removed. We've never been a perfect Hallmark family, but I thought we were at least the kind that talks things out over coffee. Instead, I found myself watching red and blue lights slide across our siding, wondering how a few words on a phone could twist everything this far for us. My mom, Linda, has always been loud about loving us, but quiet about actually listening. I'm the oldest, the responsible one, while my younger brother, Jason, is the golden child who can do no wrong if he smiles at the right time. Growing up, I learned to smooth things over, to be the bridge. Lately, I've started wondering if being the bridge just meant being stepped on in both directions. The week everything exploded, I had moved back home temporarily after my roommate accepted a job out of state. It was supposed to be for 2 months, a short reset while I figured out rent and my next steps. My mom said it was fine, insisted actually, told me, "This is your home too." She sounded so sure then, like generosity came naturally. But beneath it, something tight was already pulling. I worked a late shift at the bookstore that Friday, the kind where the minutes crawl and you stare at the clock like it's personally offending you. By the time I closed, stocked, and counted the registers, it was almost midnight. I got home to a dark house, fixed myself a bowl of cereal, and saw my phone light up with a message from Mom that made my stomach twist. Her text, sent at 2:03 a.m., said, "Don't tell Jason what I did with the savings. I'll fix it before anyone notices. Promise." I stared at it for a long time, replaying every conversation we'd had about money, about the college fund Grandma left for both of you. I thought about the way Jason's tuition was always magically covered, and how I'd juggled 3 jobs and student loans without complaining. The next morning, I tried to bring it up gently, hoping we could talk like adults. I found her in the kitchen wiping down a spotless counter, which is usually her sign that she's anxious. I said, "Hey, Mom, I got a weird text from you last night. Is everything okay with the savings?" Her hand froze mid-wipe, and she gave me the tight smile I've known since childhood arguments. She said she didn't know what I was talking about, that I must have dreamed it, that my phone probably glitched. When I showed her the screen, her face went pale for half a second before she switched to anger so fast it made my head spin. "You always think you're better than me," she snapped, like I'd accused her of a crime instead of asking a question. It stung more than I expected. I told her I wasn't accusing, just trying to understand. I mentioned Grandma's savings and how I'd assumed it was split between Jason and me. Her eyes flashed. "You left," she said, like that was some unforgivable sin. "You moved out. You made your own life. Jason stayed. He needed help. Don't act like you're a victim." Suddenly, the text wasn't just about numbers. It was about who counted as family. The air between us thickened, full of old conversations we'd never really finished. I said it didn't feel fair that my share might have quietly become Jason's, that secrets never stay small. She slammed the dish towel down and said I was ungrateful, that I was trying to turn Jason against her, that I always show up when I need something. It hurt, because needing a landing place felt shameful already. I tried walking away to cool off, but she followed me down the hallway, words chasing after me. She accused me of bringing drama into her house, of judging how she handled money, of disrespecting her sacrifices. Part of me wanted to shout back every memory I had of covering my own bills, but another part knew yelling wouldn't change how she saw me. So I just said, "We need boundaries, Mom." That word, boundaries, landed like a slap, even though I'd said it quietly. She froze for a moment. Then her voice dropped into that low, dangerous tone I remembered from teenage years. "If you don't like how I do things in my house, you can leave," she said. Something in me stood straighter, surprised by itself, and I heard myself answer, Then maybe I will, but we still need to talk about the text. The rest of the day was cold shoulders and slammed cabinets. Jason wasn't home. He was at some weekend tournament, exactly the kind of thing Grandma's money had helped fund. By evening, Mom had worked herself into a storm. I heard her on the phone with a friend, telling a version of the story where I was threatening her, where I was making accusations. It felt like listening to someone rewrite my childhood. That night, I packed a couple of bags, not dramatically, just methodically. I didn't want another screaming match. I figured I'd stay with a coworker for a week, breathe, think. When I told Mom I'd be leaving in the morning, she narrowed her eyes and asked if I was planning to steal anything on the way out. The accusation hit so hard I laughed, not from humor, but from disbelief and hurt. Morning came with an unexpected soundtrack, knocking, firm and official, at the front door. My mom rushed past me and opened it, slipping instantly into her helpless voice. A police officer stood on the porch, one hand resting gently near his belt, the other holding a small notepad. "Ma'am, we got a call about a domestic situation," he said. My heart dropped even though nothing truly dangerous had happened. I stepped into view, feeling suddenly like I was intruding on my own life. Mom pointed at me dramatically, telling the officer I was out of control, that I'd threatened her, that she was scared. The words didn't match the actual week we'd had, but I could see how convincing she sounded. I could also see how much she believed her own story, which might have been the worst part. The officer, whose name tag read M. Garcia, turned to me and asked calmly what was going on. I took a breath and, instead of defending every detail, I pulled out my phone. My hands shook a little, but I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread. "Sir," I said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is the text my mom sent me at 2 this morning. It's what we've been arguing about." He read the message slowly, his eyes moving back and forth, making sure he understood the words. I watched his face change, not to shock or drama, just to quiet comprehension. Then he looked at my mom and asked, still gentle, "Ma'am, did you send this?" For a long second, she didn't answer, her mouth opening and closing like she might find another story hiding somewhere behind her teeth. Finally, she whispered. I was stressed and looked everywhere but at me. The officer nodded, like he'd seen this kind of tangled love and fear before. He suggested we both take some space, that I had every right to leave calmly with my things, and that there was no sign of a crime, just a family that needed honesty. Hearing that from a stranger felt strangely like someone opening a stuck window. After he left, the house felt different, like a stage after everyone has gone home. Mom wouldn't meet my eyes, and I realized I might never get the apology my younger self still hoped for. But I could choose what happened next. I loaded my bags into my car, and before I closed the trunk, I told her quietly, "I'm not the problem you need removed. I'm the daughter who finally chose herself." I drove away from the house slower than the speed limit, like my body hadn't fully caught up with my decision. Every bump in the road made my suitcase rattle in the back seat, a physical reminder this wasn't just a pause, it was movement. The neighborhood I'd grown up in blurred past, same mailboxes, same cracked sidewalks. But I felt like a visitor now, drifting through a museum built from my own childhood. I parked 2 blocks from my friend Emily's apartment and sat there for a minute, hands fixed on the wheel. The silence in the car felt somehow louder than yesterday's argument, pressing against my ears. I wasn't fleeing danger or bruises, which made leaving harder to justify to that voice in my head. I was just finally refusing to keep standing in a place that didn't feel like love anymore. Emily opened the door in sweatpants and a stretched-out college hoodie, exactly the kind of welcome I needed. She didn't demand an explanation. She just stepped aside so I could drag my suitcase over the threshold. "Stay as long as you need," she said, like it was obvious, not a favor. Her small living room smelled like coffee and vanilla, familiar and safe in a way my old bedroom hadn't for years. When I finally explained about the 2 a.m. text and the police visit, Emily didn't gasp or curse my mom. She curled her legs under her on the couch and just listened, eyebrows drawn together, nodding where my voice shook. So she used the savings for Jason? She asked softly. Hearing it said out loud made the truth feel solid, like a piece of furniture I'd been bumping into in the dark. I told her I didn't know exact numbers, only that Grandma's college fund for both of you had quietly turned into Jason's tuition and tournaments. Emily asked if I wanted to confront him, and I realized I hadn't truly pictured my brother in any of this yet. Our relationship had always been filtered through Mom, like she stood between us holding a script we both felt obligated to read. Alone, almost. Later that afternoon, I lay on Emily's couch staring at the ceiling, my phone resting warm against my chest. Notifications had stacked up like little landmines. 2 missed calls from Mom, 1 from Jason, 3 long texts from Mom. One started with, "I can't believe you embarrassed me like that," and ended with, "You've chosen strangers over family." Each sentence weighed more than the overstuffed suitcase sitting by Emily's hallway. Instead of answering her right away, I opened the Notes app and started typing everything I wished I could say uninterrupted. I wrote about Grandma's promises, about watching Jason pack for college while I calculated loan interest, about feeling proud of him and hurt at the same time. Seeing it all in one place helped separate what belonged to me emotionally from what my mom kept trying to hand back. Jason's name flashing on my screen again made my stomach twist. I hovered over the decline button, then hit accept before I could overthink it. His familiar, "Hey Rach," slid through the speaker, sounding more tentative than usual. He said Mom told him I'd gone off the rails and asked if I was okay. There was more confusion than judgment in his voice, which gave me a tiny opening to step through. I told him about the text, about the officer, about leaving with my bags instead of another argument. There was a long silence on his end, then a quiet, "She really texted you that?" I repeated the exact wording, careful not to dramatize it. He sighed, and I heard the creak of his dorm bed springs through the phone. "She told me Grandma's money was complicated," he admitted. I didn't ask many questions. I could have dumped years of resentment on him right then, but something in his tone stopped me. He sounded like someone who'd been handed benefits with a side of guilt and told it was love. "This isn't about you getting help," I said. "It's about being honest that it came from something meant for both of us." Separating him from her choices loosened something tight in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. Jason asked what I wanted now, practically speaking, like there might be a checklist we could follow. I realized I didn't have a neat answer ready. Part of me wanted Mom to admit what she'd done and apologize without excuses. Part of me wanted the money magically restored, labeled with my name. Mostly, though, I wanted to stop feeling like I had to earn a seat at my own family's table every time I visited. That night, Emily made pasta and turned on a mindless baking show, the kind where people cry about frosting instead of families. Between bites, she asked if I'd ever considered therapy, not as a punishment, but as a mirror. I laughed automatically, then felt the laugh die in my throat. I'd spent years being the emotional therapist for everyone else, yet somehow never pictured myself on the other side of that conversation. I booked an appointment online before I could talk myself out of it. On the intake form, under "Reason for Seeking Therapy," I typed, "I don't know how to have a relationship with my mom that doesn't erase me." Seeing those words on the screen made me cringe and exhale at the same time. I wondered what some stranger would imagine about us from that single sentence, and whether they'd still recognize me inside it. The days before that first session were strangely quiet. Mom's messages shifted from pure anger to something guilt-laced, from "you humiliated me" to "after everything I've done for you," to "one day you'll regret pushing me away." She never once mentioned the 2 a.m. text, as if acknowledging it would topple the story she was clinging to. I replied politely, in short bursts, refusing to explain myself into exhaustion again. Jason and I started texting more, but about small things at first. His classes, my customers at the bookstore, ridiculous new cereal flavors. There was a gentleness to it that surprised me, like we were finally meeting each other without Mom directing the scene. Eventually, he asked if he could see a screenshot of the text, and my fingers trembled anyway as I hit send. Waiting for his response felt like holding my breath underwater. His reply came 10 minutes later. "I'm sorry." I didn't know. I should have asked. I stared at those words, feeling validation and sadness rise together like conflicting tides. I wrote back, "We were kids when she made those choices. I just don't want us pretending they didn't happen." It felt like inviting him into the real story instead of the polished family version we'd been performing for years. Letting him in also meant admitting how much I still cared. At my first therapy session, I ended up talking about the police officer more than I'd expected. I described how calm he'd been, how he'd looked at both of us like real people instead of choosing a villain. "It sounds like he believed your reality," my therapist said. "Maybe that's new for you with your mom." I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to name that quiet ache I'd been carrying for years. We talked about roles, how I'd been the fixer, the bridge, the good girl who didn't cause trouble. She asked what it had cost me to stay in that role, and I pictured a folding table at Thanksgiving, sagging under too many dishes. "It cost me the right to say, 'This hurts,' without being called ungrateful," I said slowly. Hearing myself admit that out loud felt like discovering a bruise I'd taught myself to ignore. About a week later, Jason texted asking if we could meet for coffee while he was in town. I chose a neutral cafe downtown, far from our neighborhood. When he walked in, same crooked smile, same nervous shoulder shrug. I felt a wave of nostalgia and protectiveness. We hugged awkwardly and spent a few minutes over stirring our drinks before he finally said, "I think she's scared you won't come back this time." "I don't know if I will, at least not in the same way," I answered. And he nodded, eyes on his cup. He told me he'd asked Mom about Grandma's savings and she'd snapped at him too, accusing him of taking my side. We agreed to keep talking directly, to share whatever we learned. It felt like building a new bridge between us, one that didn't require me to lie down as the foundation. The week after meeting Jason felt like standing in shallow water after nearly drowning. Everything looked the same, but my body moved differently. I went to work, shelved paperbacks, smiled at customers, and caught myself watching mothers with their daughters in a new way. I searched for small signs of honesty between them, as if I were studying a language I no longer fully trusted. It made me wonder how many families look fine from the outside, while quietly reassigning love behind closed doors. Mom stopped texting for 3 days, which felt louder than her earlier accusations. I checked my phone more often than I like to admit, not because I wanted another fight, but because silence carries its own meanings. When she finally wrote, the message was short and oddly gentle. "Can we talk this weekend?" No apology, no explanation, just that. I sat on Emily's couch holding my phone, feeling the weight of my next choice settle in my hands. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I went for a long walk through the neighborhood near Emily's apartment, past manicured lawns and porch swings that made me think of childhood summers. I practiced what I might say out loud, testing sentences like stones in my mouth. Some tasted bitter, accusatory and sharp. Others felt too soft, like surrender. I wanted words that could stand upright without turning into either a blade or a blanket. At my second therapy session, I told my therapist about Mom's request. She asked how my body reacted when I read the text. I noticed my shoulders had lifted as if bracing for impact. "That's useful information," she said gently. We talked about boundaries not as walls, but as doors I could choose when to open. The idea that I could control the timing of vulnerability felt unfamiliar and strangely empowering at the same time. Jason texted later that night asking if I'd heard from Mom too. I told him she wanted to talk and that I hadn't committed. He admitted he'd argued with her again about the savings and that she'd accused him of being ungrateful. There was an edge of exhaustion in his words I hadn't heard before. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same side of a storm instead of taking turns getting soaked by it. By Friday afternoon, I agreed to meet Mom at a diner halfway between our places. It felt symbolic to choose neutral ground, like placing the conversation on a table neither of us owned. I arrived early and ordered coffee, watching steam curl upward while my nerves tapped out nervous rhythms through my legs. When she walked in, she looked smaller somehow, as if anger had been propping her up more than I realized. We sat facing each other in a vinyl booth that stuck to the backs of our arms. The waitress brought menus, but neither of us touched them. Mom started with safe territory, how the neighbor's dog had gotten loose, how Jason's tournament went. I let her talk, noticing how carefully she stepped around the edges of what actually brought us there. Her avoidance felt like another kind of confession, though I wasn't yet sure what to do with it. Eventually, I said quietly, "We have to talk about the text." The words fell between us like a dropped spoon, sharp and undeniable. Mom's eyes flicked toward the window, then back to me. She took a breath that sounded like it hurt. "I was overwhelmed," she said. "I didn't mean for things to get that far." She still didn't say she was wrong, only that she was tired. The difference felt important. I told her how it felt to see Grandma's promise reshape itself without my knowledge. I spoke about juggling loans while watching Jason live the version of security I'd once imagined for us both. Saying it out loud didn't feel like an attack. It felt like setting a heavy box down after carrying it alone for years. Mom's face tightened, but she listened in a way she rarely had when I talked about anything that made her uncomfortable. She admitted she'd taken from the savings when Jason was accepted into that expensive prep program, then again when tuition rose. "You already had momentum," she said, as if it explained everything. "You were managing." The words landed harder than she realized. I understood the logic she was using, but logic doesn't always behave kindly. Being the one who manages suddenly sounded like a quiet lifetime appointment I'd never applied for. I asked why she hadn't told me. She twisted her napkin between her fingers and said she'd been afraid I'd judge her. That small sentence carried more honesty than the louder ones she'd thrown at me for years. "I didn't want to feel like I failed," she added. I watched the fear underneath her pride flicker like low battery light. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it helped me understand the shape of the wound she'd been hiding behind us. We talked for nearly an hour, mostly in careful, uneven steps. I told her I wasn't asking for perfection, only for truth. She said she wasn't sure she knew how to give me that without feeling like a villain. I told her I didn't need a villain. I needed a mother who could admit mistakes without calling them sacrifices. The space between us felt fragile, but it was also the clearest it had been in a long time. When the conversation paused, the waitress returned, and we finally ordered food, like two people rediscovering the rules of an ordinary interaction. As we ate, Mom asked about my plans, where I was living, what I wanted next. It was the first time in weeks her questions didn't sound like an interrogation or a defense. I noticed how my shoulders relaxed slightly as she listened without interrupting, and that quiet shift felt like progress I hadn't dared to imagine earlier. Before we left, we addressed the hardest part: the money itself. She couldn't replace what was gone, not anytime soon. Hearing that stung, but it wasn't a surprise. What mattered more was that she acknowledged it as mine too, not just Jason's by default. She said she would talk with him openly, without disguising it as generosity. I didn't know yet whether that conversation would truly happen, but the promise existed in the open now. Jason called me that evening, his voice cautious. "She told me everything," he said. We talked honestly about the pressure he'd felt to succeed, the guilt he'd buried under gratitude. For the first time, our shared childhood stories lined up instead of contradicting each other. We didn't solve anything neatly, but we ended the call feeling less like actors in a family script and more like siblings allowed to rewrite their lines slowly. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes in myself. I stopped checking my phone obsessively. I slept deeper. At work, I found it easier to focus on customers' small stories instead of replaying mine. Nothing dramatic had shifted outwardly, but inwardly, I felt like I'd cleared a room that had been filled with clutter for years. The emptiness wasn't loss. It was space where new choices might finally fit. Emily remarked that I seemed lighter one evening while we were folding laundry together. I told her it wasn't happiness exactly. More like relief mixed with uncertainty. She nodded as if that combination made perfect sense. "That's usually where real change lives," she said. I thought about how rarely anyone had ever given me permission to feel uncertain without labeling it as failure. That alone felt like a small inheritance I wished I'd received sooner. Mom and I didn't slide back into easy closeness, and strangely, that felt healthy. Our messages stayed shorter and more careful, but also more honest. When she felt defensive, she sometimes said so out loud instead of turning it into an attack. I learned to pause before responding instead of instantly smoothing things over. It was awkward, like learning a new muscle pattern, but it made our conversations feel less performative and more real. Jason started sending me updates about school and his part-time job. He told me he'd turned down one expensive extracurricular Mom wanted to fund and chosen a cheaper option instead. He didn't frame it as a sacrifice for me, which I appreciated. It felt like he was beginning to make choices with open eyes rather than inherited obligations. Watching him do that stirred a complex pride in me, layered with sadness for how long it took. One afternoon, driving back from therapy, I realized I no longer felt ashamed about having left Mom's house with a suitcase. The image had reformed itself in my mind. Not a betrayal, but a boundary that kept me intact. That shift felt subtle, yet monumental, like noticing a scar has finally softened. It made me curious about what other stories I'd been telling myself that might be ready for revision now. As summer edged closer, I caught myself imagining future holidays with a cautious hope instead of dread. I didn't picture perfect dinners or dramatic reconciliations anymore. I pictured choices, short visits, shared walks, honest conversations that might still be uncomfortable but not destructive. For the first time, I wasn't seeking a return to what we were. I was quietly wondering who we might become if none of us had to disappear to keep the peace. Fall arrived quietly, and with it a new rhythm to my days that no longer revolved around bracing for conflict. I found a small studio apartment above a bakery, the kind of place that always smelled faintly like sugar and heat. It wasn't grand, but it was fully mine. Each morning, sunlight climbed the opposite brick wall and spilled through my only window, reminding me that stability could be simple and still feel earned. Moving my things out of Emily's apartment felt less like escape and more like graduation. She helped me hang curtains and carried boxes without asking what they held, trusting that I'd share what mattered in my own time. That night, sitting on my mattress on the floor, surrounded by half-opened cartons, I felt a fragile pride. This life wasn't flashy, but it was chosen, and that distinction gently reshaped how I saw myself. Mom called a week after I moved in. Her voice sounded unsure, as if she weren't certain she'd still reach me here. She asked about the bakery downstairs, about my rent, about whether the stairs were steep. The questions were ordinary, almost domestic, and that ordinariness marked a shift. We didn't talk about the savings or the police or the diner. We talked about bread smells and creaky floors, easing into something that felt like cautious reconnection. Jason visited one Saturday with 2 coffees and an awkward smile. He admired my tiny kitchen like it was a palace, opening cabinets and pretending to plan where things should go. We sat on the floor and talked about his job, about the pressure he felt to justify the money spent on him. I told him again that his success didn't require my shrinking. Saying it aloud reminded both of us that guilt didn't need to be our only bridge. At work, a woman returned a dog-eared novel she'd bought weeks earlier and thanked me for recommending it, telling me it made her call her sister after years of silence. I smiled and nodded, but inside, something stirred. I wondered how many invisible family negotiations passed through my hands with each transaction. It made the bookstore feel less like retail and more like a quiet crossroads of people carrying their own versions of love and repair. Therapy began to circle deeper questions. My therapist asked what I wanted my relationship with Mom to look like if money were no longer the center of it. I had to think longer than I expected. I said I wanted to be seen without being evaluated for how useful I was. She challenged me to imagine asking for that directly someday. The idea both thrilled and terrified me, which felt like honest evidence it mattered. Around Thanksgiving, Mom invited both Jason and me to her house. The invitation was simple and didn't carry its usual undercurrent of obligation. I hesitated before answering, measuring my courage against my caution. Jason texted that he planned to go but understood if I didn't. After a night of pacing my small apartment, I finally replied yes, deciding that absence would no longer be my default form of protection. Walking into Mom's kitchen that day felt like stepping into a photograph, only slightly out of alignment. Everything looked familiar, yet my body reacted differently. I noticed how loudly the clock ticked, how the smell of roasted turkey felt heavier than memory. Mom hugged me with a softness that surprised us both. No one mentioned the police or the savings. We spoke through plates and passing dishes, practicing a quieter kind of truce. At dinner, Jason thanked Mom for being honest with him about the money. The table stilled for a heartbeat, then resumed its gentle clatter. Mom nodded and said she was still learning how to tell hard truths without armor. I watched that exchange like someone watching a weather pattern change, uncertain how lasting it might be but aware that even brief clarity alters the air. My chest felt tight, yet I stayed. That evening, after Jason left, Mom and I rinsed dishes together. The old choreography returned easily, but the silence between us was new. Eventually she said, "I should have trusted you to be angry and still love me." The sentence landed carefully, as if testing the floor. I replied that I was still learning how to hold both emotions at once. We stood there with wet hands and uncertain peace, letting that truth rest without rushing to fix it. Back in my apartment, I unpacked the last box and found an envelope of old photos I hadn't meant to bring, pictures of Jason and me as kids, grinning with missing teeth, Mom behind us with her hands on our shoulders. I studied her younger face and wondered when fear first taught her to protect one child by quietly borrowing from the other. The photos didn't answer me, but they softened the edges of the question. December stretched long and reflective. At night, I wrote in that notes app again, but now it wasn't only grievances. I wrote what I was learning about myself, that I don't disappear when someone is disappointed, that boundaries can coexist with affection, that fairness doesn't always arrive as a refund. Seeing growth beside grief gave both emotions a more honest scale. It also made me curious about which parts of myself I'd ignored while staying manageable. Emily visited near Christmas with a bag of thrift store ornaments and helped me decorate a narrow string of lights around my lone window. We drank cheap hot chocolate and joked about how adulthood is mostly improvisation with better vocabulary. I told her how the diner talk with Mom had shifted things. She reminded me that progress rarely feels dramatic in the moment. It feels like rearranging furniture and realizing only later that the whole room breathes differently now. Jason sent me a message from home saying Mom seemed quieter this year, less commanding at the center of everything. He didn't sound relieved exactly, more observant. I wondered how many versions of her he was discovering now that he wasn't reflexively defending one. It made me think about how children adapt themselves to the gravity of a parent without always knowing it. Recognizing that pattern didn't excuse her choices, but it reframed the story we shared. On New Year's Eve, alone in my apartment with bakery steam still rising through the floorboards, I wrote down 3 intentions instead of resolutions. One was to keep speaking even when my voice shakes. Another was to ask for help without apology when I need it. The third was to allow relationships to change without calling that failure. None of them sounded flashy enough for tradition, but they felt truer than anything I'd promised myself before. January brought a letter from Mom, an actual paper letter, folded carefully and smudged with her familiar handwriting. Inside, she apologized without wrapping it in sacrifice or explanation. The words were imperfect and uneven, but they were not angry. She did not offer solutions or timelines, only acknowledgement. I read it twice on my narrow bed, surprise and sadness tangling together. I wasn't sure what this apology could rebuild, but I knew it changed the ground beneath it. I replied with my own letter, slower than any text I'd ever composed. I thanked her for the honesty, told her I wasn't ready to pretend everything was mended, but that I was willing to keep talking. Writing that felt like standing on a bridge that neither of us owned completely, suspended by mutual risk. When I slid it into the mailbox, I felt both exposed and strangely steady. At therapy, I talked about the letters and how they didn't resolve the financial damage yet shifted the emotional weight of it. My therapist asked what forgiveness meant to me if it wasn't a clean erasure. I said maybe it meant choosing to stop carrying the sharpest version of the past as my sole reference point. That answer surprised me with its gentleness. I realized I was less interested in victory now than in durability. One quiet afternoon, Mom called to ask if I wanted to walk with her at a nearby park the next weekend. The request felt tentative, almost shy. I checked in with myself before answering, listening for panic instead of habit. When I said yes, my voice sounded grounded. After the call ended, I stood by my window watching a customer below carry out a box of pastries, wondering how many small yeses eventually add up to a changed story. As winter deepened, I felt my fear of family gatherings loosen into something more workable, caution without paralysis. I no longer rehearsed entire arguments in my head before every interaction. Instead, I trusted that I could respond in real time, even imperfectly. That trust altered how I moved through my days, as if I'd discovered a hidden support beam inside myself. I wasn't fixed, but I was finally, quietly, on my own side. Spring arrived on a Sunday that felt small and ordinary, which made it easier to face what waited at the park. I showed up early and chose a bench near the pond where ducks stitched slow lines through reflected sky. When Mom approached, she didn't wave, just walked with hands in her pockets like someone uncertain whether to knock. We sat side by side without rushing into words, letting distance and closeness negotiate between our shoulders. She talked first, not about money, not about blame, but about how strange it felt to grow quieter as a parent when your children grow louder in the world. I listened without correcting her or filling in the gaps. It felt new to let her speak without planning a defense. When she finished, she looked at me like she expected a verdict. I offered none, only the truth that I was still learning how to be her daughter without shrinking. We walked the loop slowly. At one point, she admitted she'd confused protection with control for most of her life, and that fear had trained her hands before love did. I didn't absolve her, and she didn't ask me to. The honesty stood between us like a modest gift neither of us had practiced receiving. I noticed how my breath stayed even while she spoke, and that steadiness felt like a quiet victory. Jason joined us by the water with 2 coffees and an embarrassed half-smile, the 3 of us forming an unfamiliar triangle. Conversation drifted to safe topics and then wandered into risk. He talked about switching majors, about wanting work that felt like service instead of proof. Mom listened without interrupting. I watched for the old reflex to steer him, but it didn't arrive. Letting him choose felt like a test for her and a release for me. Later, after Jason left, Mom asked if I ever felt guilty for leaving home. The question was tender and dangerous at once. I told her yes sometimes, but that guilt no longer decided my future. Naming that felt both courteous and firm, like closing a door softly but completely. She nodded, eyes wet but steady. We parted without promises, only a shared understanding that returning to old patterns would require conscious effort from both of us. In the weeks that followed, our contact remained modest and consistent. No sudden floods of affection, no dramatic retreats. Messages about weather, about the dog next door, about the bakery below my apartment that kept selling out before noon. Each exchange was ordinary enough to be real. Slowly, the absence of crisis began to feel like its own form of trust. I learned to value that quiet more than I ever valued the loud reconciliations of the past. Jason and I met for lunch every other Friday. The ritual steadied us. We spoke about jobs and relationships and how differently we remembered the same childhood holidays. Sometimes those differences still hurt, but they no longer felt like accusations. They felt like 2 maps overlapping imperfectly. When he thanked me for challenging Mom without demonizing him, I told him that being siblings didn't require shared debt, only shared presence. He seemed to carry that with him afterward. At work, the bookstore felt like a living calendar. School-aged kids lingered near test prep guides, retirees asked for biographies, and a young woman returned to tell me her mother finally cried at a passage we'd discussed weeks earlier. I took these small reports as proof that stories move in subtle arcs. It made me kinder with my own narrative, reminding me that most important shifts don't announce themselves with music or speeches. My therapist asked one afternoon what I'd lost through all of this. The answer arrived quickly. I'd lost the fantasy that fairness would be handed back to me with an apology and a check. What surprised me was the second loss, slower and gentler. The loss of needing that fantasy to feel whole. Grief and relief braided together inside that realization. I left the office that day lighter, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped waiting. Emily moved in with her partner across town, and I helped paint their living room a cautious shade of green. Watching her choose a shared future made me think about how many shapes belonging can take without mimicking childhood. That night, alone, I cooked for one and ate at my small table by the window. The bakery's late trays rolled out below like quiet drum beats. I felt a contentment that didn't ask for witnesses, and that felt like progress. Mom mailed me a photo she found from the year Grandma taught me to swim. On the back she'd written, "You always climbed out and tried again." I stared at that sentence for a long time. It wasn't an apology, but it was a recognition of who I'd been even then. I sent back a note thanking her for remembering that part of me. It felt like trading small truths instead of large defenses. When summer arrived, Jason invited me to a volunteer day with his campus group. We spent a Saturday sorting donated books at a community center, laughing at outdated covers and earnest author photos. At the end, he told me quietly that he'd started setting aside part of his earnings for our shared family future. Weddings, emergencies, the unknown. I told him I didn't need repayment to feel respected, but I valued the intention behind his choice. I saw Mom again at a birthday dinner for a distant cousin. The room was crowded and loud, yet she kept checking my face as if reading weather patterns. At one point, she pulled me aside and asked if she could introduce me without commentary. The request startled me with its humility. When she simply said my name and what I did, I felt both invisible and finally seen in the right measure, like being known without being claimed. Near the end of August, I found my old phone case while cleaning, a scuffed reminder of the night the text changed everything. I held it for a moment and then threw it away, not because the memory was gone, but because it no longer needed a shrine. The day moved on without ceremony. I stocked shelves, answered questions, ate a sandwich on the back step, and felt a surprising steadiness settle where rage once rehearsed. Mom asked if I would spend a weekend at her place to help sort through the attic. I told her yes with clear conditions about time and space. She agreed without bargaining. We worked among dust and forgotten boxes, speaking in manageable strides. She showed me a stack of old letters from Grandma that she'd been too afraid to read. We opened one together, both quiet, letting history feel heavy without letting it crush us. That night, lying on the old bed, I noticed I slept without rehearsing exits. The house had changed, or maybe I had. In the morning, Mom made coffee and asked what I wanted next. Career, love, the rest of my life, without framing my answers as problems to solve. I realized then that trust isn't rebuilt by grand gestures. It returns in small permissions, offered again and again until they begin to feel ordinary. Back home, I updated my resume and applied for a program I'd quietly wanted for years. The application asked about adversity and growth in the same breath. I wrote about choosing clarity over comfort, about learning to stay while changing the rules of staying. Hitting submit felt like opening a window in a room I'd finally arranged to fit myself. Whatever came back wouldn't define me, but the attempt already had. Jason called to say Mom had asked him what boundaries meant to him, not just me. I smiled at that through the phone, picturing her learning a new word the slow way. He said it felt strange and reassuring at once. I told him that strangeness often marks the beginning of honesty. We sat in shared quiet for a moment, connected not by urgency but by a sense of forward motion neither of us needed to rush. When the acceptance email arrived for the program, I cried alone in my kitchen and then texted Emily, Jason, and finally Mom. Their replies were different in tone, but equal in care. Mom wrote, "I'm proud of you," without modifiers. The sentence landed cleanly without hooks. I let it stand as it was, neither clutched nor questioned, and felt something in me loosen that I'd once thought permanently knotted. Now, when I think back to that night with the flashing lights, it doesn't feel like a spectacle anymore. It feels like the hinge in a door I learned how to open. What followed wasn't a miracle, but a series of choices. Imperfect, human, persistent. I'm still learning how to be a daughter without disappearing, a sister without bargaining, a woman without apology. And I'm curious which quiet choice will surprise me next.